Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Integrative Conservation webinar. As you know, this is part of a series that we do every month, the first Tuesday of every month, normally at 4:30 p.m. China time. But before we go with the information about today's seminar, let me just give a bit of announcements and some housekeeping. This is part of a program by Integrative Conservation that is a new academic journal, or relatively new, launched in 2022. That is it's a global journal on conservation published by the Tatsuya Amano Tropical Botanical Garden, part of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. And we publish on all kinds of taxa from all geographies and any kind of biomes. It's an open access journal, and it is free of publication fees, at least for the next couple of years. And relevant to what we will be talking today, Integrative Conservation makes a strong effort to overcome language barriers. So we'll talk more about that later. And we have right now 3 calls for papers for ongoing special issues. One is on conservation and management of forest biodiversity and ecosystem functions by forest canopies. Another one on snow leopard conservation. And another one on nature education, connecting humans and nature for conservation. This one is focusing mainly in China, but not exclusively. So then if you have papers relevant to these issues and you want to submit, please be free to do so. And if you are interested in editing a special issue or special collection, please contact us. We're very much welcome guest editors to work on these topics. If you want to know more about the journal, you can just scan this QR code and then go there to see our latest issue. And as I was saying, these webinars happen the first Tuesday of every month. They are normally at 4:30 p.m. China time, although sometimes we adjust depending on the time zone where speakers are in and other issues. Next month, on 2nd of April, we'll have Marcel Holyoke from the University of California, Berkeley. And these webinars are also part of the weekly webinars organized by the Tatsuya Amano Tropical Botanical Garden. So then the actual program is wider. So let's go to today's webinar. Today we are very lucky to have Dr. Tatsuya Amano, who is a senior lecturer at the University of Queensland at the School of Environment, and is also the Deputy Director in Research at the Center of Biodiversity and Conservation. And Dr. Amano is working as a conservation scientist, working on understanding changes in global biodiversity and providing scientific evidence for its conservation. As you can tell from the name, Amano is from Japan, and he became very committed to unveiling the importance and consequences of language barriers for conservation. As some of you might tell from my accent and from the accent of many of the people you will be listening during the Q&A question, a big part of the community of biodiversity integrative conservation are people living in countries, so originally from countries that are not where English is not the first language. And actually, we have a very rich diversity of languages in our community. So I think this topic is very relevant for us. And Dr. Amano is a member of the editorial board of Integrative Conservation. Actually, he was one of the first people to join the board. And he has been very active on helping us to think about how we deal with language barriers in the way we do our work as an academic journal. So without any further ado, I will just pass the floor to Dr. Amano. So then, Amano, whenever you want, you can just share your screens and we'll start. Just a final comment, Dr. Amano will talk for around 45 to 50 minutes, and after that we'll have around 30 minutes of Q&A. So then please stay for the Q&A and feel free to make your questions later. Thank you very much, Amano.
Okay. Can you see the screen? See the slide?
Yeah, we can see it. We can see well.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. So thanks very much, James, for the very great introduction to myself, and also introduction to this topic of language barriers. So it is my great pleasure to be giving this presentation on our project called the Translate Project. for this webinar series, and I really appreciate this opportunity. And as Imsa said, I'm also one of the editorial board members of this journal, Integrative Conservation. So thank you for participating in this webinar series. So almost 5 years ago, we launched this project called the Translate Project. By the way, this is a website, so please visit our website if you're interested. And the main objective of this project is to investigate and overcome the consequences of language barriers in conservation, and more broadly in science in general. So in this presentation, I hope to give an overview of language barriers in biodiversity conservation, why it's important, why it has so many consequences for conservation, based on our project's outcomes so far. Okay, so let me first start by explaining why language matters in conservation. First, how many languages are there in the world? The answer is, it's about 7,000. There are 7,000, actually over 7,000 languages around the world. Next, how many native English speakers are there in the world? The answer is 380 million. It's a lot, but a relatively small proportion of the world's population. And this actually means that 95% of the 8 billion people in the world are actually non-native English speakers. And as you know, we are starting to recognize increasingly that the biodiversity crisis we are facing now is not only about biodiversity. It is actually about people and biodiversity, because people threaten biodiversity, people conserve biodiversity, and biodiversity has a lot to offer to people. And those people from around the world use 7,000 languages to communicate. So why would we not take languages into account when studying biodiversity and tackling its conservation? To me, it only seems natural and absolutely necessary to consider how having so many languages among us might affect our understanding and also conservation of global biodiversity. Next, let's also take a look at these two maps. The map on the left shows the states and territories where English is the first language. The map on the right is the distribution of certain species. And as you can see, we have two very contrasting maps. The regions where biodiversity is the richest and is threatened the most, and therefore conservation is needed the most, are often regions where English is not widely spoken. So there is a mismatch between these two maps. In a study nicely led by Pablo Nigret, we looked at the number of official languages spoken within the distribution of each of the 10,000 bird species around the world. Importantly, we found that over 1,500 species, including 43 threatened species, had 10 or even more official languages spoken within their distribution range. As you can see in this figure, some threatened species shown in red and yellow here, including, some threatened species actually have 20, 30, or even 50 official languages spoken within their distribution range. So in order to study and conserve those species, we clearly need to understand the consequences of having so many languages spoken within a species distribution. And that's exactly why our Translate project has been investigating the many consequences of language barriers in biodiversity conservation. This includes language barriers to the global synthesis of scientific evidence, the local application of scientific evidence, and the generation of scientific evidence by non-native English speakers. More specifically, in this paper, we showed that up to 36% of scientific documents on biodiversity conservation appeared to be published in languages other than English. But such non-English language scientific evidence is likely underused in the global level synthesis of evidence because it's not readily accessible. But this is the language barrier to the global synthesis of scientific evidence. And then there's another type of language barriers where scientific evidence available only in English is not effectively used in the local application of scientific evidence, such as local decision-making in countries where English is not widely spoken. So this is the language barriers to the application of evidence. Finally, because of the language barrier, non-native English speakers may not be able to fully contribute to the generation of scientific evidence. This is the language barrier to the generation of evidence. In this talk, I will introduce some of our works on each type of language barriers in science and conservation. Okay, so let's first look at how language barriers might impede the synthesis of scientific evidence. So first of all, how is non-English language science used in global evidence synthesis? Here we looked at the proportion of references cited in these 8 international assessments on biodiversity by language. And not surprisingly, English language references dominate in most assessments, with on average 96% of the references cited being in English. And this is in clear contrast to the result we saw earlier that 36% of existing conservation literature was actually written in non-English languages. The same is true for more rigorous systematic literature reviews. In this research led by Kelsey Hanna, we looked at the use of non-English language literature in all the systematic literature reviews and maps published in the journal Environmental Evidence. And we found that only 38% proactively searched for papers in at least one language other than English. And then even in these 38% of the reviews, most languages searched were of European origin, as you can see here. And for example, no Asian languages were searched, although many of these had a global focus. So this clearly indicates that most of the existing non-English language science is not being used in global level evidence synthesis. So next, what are the consequences of ignoring non-English language science? In this paper, we conducted comprehensive searches for non-English language literature on conservation. The Conservation Evidence Database stores English language studies that test the effectiveness of conservation actions identified based on a set of selection criteria. So our project has also used the same criteria to identify relevant non-English language studies. And then we identified 1,234 non-English language studies that provide evidence on the effectiveness of conservation interventions compared to 4,412 English language studies stored at the Conservation Evidence Database at that time. So we can at least say that by ignoring non-English language science, we could be losing access to this amount of scientific evidence. During the searches, we have also identified 466 journals in 19 different languages, some of which have been actually publishing papers since the 19th century. But this result alone also indicates that the non-negligible amount of scientific evidence is still being published in non-English languages too. Of course, the availability of non-English language evidence varies among topics. For example, non-English language studies constitute 13% of the studies on thermal tolerance limits of amphibians, 20% of the studies on socio-ecological impacts of seaweed farming, and in an extreme case, even 93% of the studies on the use of orchards and vineyards by birds in Japan. In a study of 26 systematic reviews and maps published in the journal Environmental Evidence, we also found that median 4%, with the range between 0 and 41%, of the articles included in those reviews were non-English language studies. So the importance of non-English language evidence varies among topics, but we can at least say that a non-negligible amount of evidence is indeed available in non-English languages too. Many people often assume that such non-English language studies are diminishing as science is becoming increasingly globalized. But in this study led by Sean Chaudhry, we showed that the number of publications on biodiversity conservation has actually been increasing in most languages, especially in Spanish, here, Portuguese, Simplified Chinese, and Russian, and so on. And I've also recently learned that the new journal publishing in both Chinese and English has recently been launched in China. So contrary to a common perception, the importance of non-English language knowledge in conservation is certainly not diminishing. And another problem is that ignoring non-English language science can cause severe biases in our understanding of biodiversity. In the research area of healthcare, it has been shown that more statistically significant results are more likely to be published in English. This issue is known as language bias in evidence synthesis, more specifically language bias in statistical results, meaning that the nature and direction of a study's results can affect what language it is published in. We found language bias in statistical results in conservation too. In this paper, we showed that the effect size was hugely different between English language studies and Japanese language studies, although all these studies were used in the same meta-analysis. And in this case, ignoring non-English language studies would bias the conclusion of meta-analysis. However, a slightly different type of language bias might also exist, especially in ecology and conservation, which is language bias in study characteristics. For example, studies conducted on a local species might be more likely to get published in non-English language journals, as those studies would not be of high interest to international readers. And in our recent work, we showed that language bias in study characteristics does exist, having serious consequences for evidence synthesis. So these blue grid cells in this map show the distribution of English language studies testing the effectiveness of conservation interventions stored in the conservation evidence database. And you can see that English language studies are, unsurprisingly, concentrated in certain countries, such as the UK, US, and so on. And there's a huge gap in the availability of evidence in other parts of the world, including the most biodiverse regions, such as Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Now, when we searched non-English language studies testing the effectiveness of conservation interventions using the same selection criteria, we found a number of relevant non-English language studies in those regions with little information based on English language studies, such as Latin America, Russia, and East Asian countries. And it's not only about locations. Here's a figure that compares the study species between English and non-English language studies. So these blue bars show the number of English language studies available for each species. For example, the bird species with the highest number of English language studies was skylark here, with 44 English language studies testing interventions for this particular species. And what's most important here is those red bars showing the number of non-English language studies per species for those without any English language studies. So these include 217 bird and 64 mammal species, including this endangered Blackstone's fish owls in Japan and endangered Andean mountain cats in northern Patagonia. So this clearly indicates that there's a systematic bias in study locations and species between English and non-English language studies. And by ignoring non-English language studies, we could lose important scientific evidence for those areas and species with little or even no English language evidence. However, we also found a difference in the quality of scientific evidence provided between English and non-English language studies. Here we compared the study designs that had been adopted, and as we can see, studies in these 9 languages here used less robust study designs, meaning that the quality of scientific evidence could be lower when compared to English language studies. In contrast, Portuguese and Spanish language studies did not show a significant difference. So although results varied among languages, the quality of non-English language science does seem to be lower than that of English language science for many languages. And this means that we need to consider the trade-off between evidence quality and availability. As we have just shown, for many species in countries where English is not widely spoken, evidence may be available only in a local language, in which case using such lower quality evidence might be better than using no scientific evidence at all. So this is something we still need to investigate further. Okay, so let's move on to language barriers to the local application of scientific evidence. First of all, how is evidence made available in different languages used in local decision-making? For this, we identified national, often governmental reports on the state of biodiversity in countries, territories where English is not an official language, and looked at the proportion of references cited in those reports by language. And we were actually surprised at the very high proportion of non-English language references in most reports, shown in yellow and orange here. Across these 37 countries, territories, 65% of the references cited was, on average, in a non-English language. And as you might remember, this is a stark contrast to the international assessments, where only 3.4% of the references were written in non-English languages. But this means that by ignoring non-English language literature, international assessments may overlook important knowledge on local and national biodiversity. And this high proportion of non-English language references in national biodiversity reports is partly due to report authors recognizing the importance of non-English language scientific evidence. For example, when we surveyed those report authors, 75% of them answered that they cited non-English language papers because they were indeed relevant to their reports. In contrast, only 25% of the report authors answered that they cited non-English language papers because they were easy to understand. This clearly indicates that in those countries where English is not an official language, non-English language literature is being used because they indeed provide relevant evidence, and not because they are just easier to understand. And we also asked those report authors how English language barriers might have impeded the use of English language literature in those reports. And a quarter of the report authors answered that they struggled with understanding English language literature when writing their reports. So this also indicates that language barriers indeed pose a serious barrier to the uptake of scientific evidence that is available only in English. So what does this mean for conservation? Did you know that there are at least 230 barriers to the use of scientific evidence in conservation? These are just some examples of those barriers. In other words, decision makers have 230 reasons for not using evidence in their decisions. And in countries where English is not widely spoken, providing necessary evidence only in English would just give decision makers yet another excuse to turn away from scientific evidence. As I said earlier, English is not necessarily widely spoken in regions where conservation is needed the most. But today, scientific knowledge on biodiversity is often published and disseminated only in English, even in those regions. And this is not ideal because users of scientific knowledge in these regions, such as practitioners, policymakers, and so on, including the general public, often prefer knowledge that is available in their first language. In fact, we are starting to see more evidence reporting this type of language barriers in conservation. For example, half the protected area directors in Spain recognize language as a barrier to the use of scientific papers in their decisions. 35% of the protected area managers in Brazil also reported the unavailability of information in Portuguese as a barrier. 12% of decision makers in Switzerland also reported language barriers, and Indonesian farmers also prefer information being communicated in their local language. So if you publish and disseminate your knowledge only in English, it may not get used effectively in countries and regions where English is not widely spoken. Okay, we now know that language barriers can have significant implications in conservation. So next, let's look at how species are associated with different languages. As you might remember, in this paper, we looked at the number of official languages spoken within the distribution of each of the 10,000 bird species. And this map shows the relationship between the number of threatened bird species, and the number of languages in species geographical range. Here, we found that these areas in Central and Western Asia, shown in wine red, have particularly high numbers of species associated with many languages. So we could perhaps say that paying attention to language barriers could be particularly important for the conservation of species in these regions, shown in wine red. Also, from the this link, you can also explore an interactive map showing where we can find bird species associated with each official language. So please do visit this website as well. Okay, so finally, let me also explain language barriers to the generation of scientific evidence by non-native English speakers. Because science is now conducted largely in English, non-native English speakers can face multiple barriers when conducting different types of scientific activities in English, such as paper reading, paper writing, paper publication, and research dissemination. So in our latest study, we tried to quantify these barriers for non-native English speakers by comparing the amount of effort needed to conduct different scientific activities in English between non-native and native English speakers. Here we surveyed 908 environmental scientists from 8 different countries, and we selected these 8 countries based on their English proficiency and income levels, so that we can compare results between researchers of different linguistic and economic backgrounds. And what we found was striking. When comparing native and non-native English speakers with only one publication, so this is essentially early career researchers, our survey shows that non-native English speakers need 91% more time to read each paper in English. So this means their hurdle is twice as high as that of native English speakers. Then they also need 51% more time to write each paper in English. Before they can submit, they still need to ask someone to proofread their English for most of their papers. Even then, their papers are more likely to be rejected simply due to their English writing. And that frequency is 2.6 times higher in non-native English speakers than native English speakers. There's also a huge difference in the frequency of language-related paper revision. Non-native English speakers are requested to revise their papers 12 times more often than native English speakers. When preparing an oral presentation, they also need 94% more time than native English speakers, and what's more, 30% of them often decide not to attend an international conference, and half of them decide not to give an oral presentation due to English language barriers. And it's not the end of the race. As long as you are in a research career, you will face these barriers every time you do any of these scientific activities. So it's pretty clear that these disadvantages can impede the participation and career development of non-native English speakers in science, seriously impeding their contribution to the generation of scientific evidence globally. We can also see other evidence reporting this type of language barriers in science. For example, here we have two English sentences with exactly the same content, but there's a slight difference in the writing style. The sentence on the left is native-like English, and that on the right is non-native-like English. But as you can see, the difference is so subtle, like if it has focused here versus just focused here. And the problem is that the study based on randomized control trials showed that science written in this non-native-like way tends to be rated lower, although the scientific content is exactly the same. So this is a serious problem. And other studies suggest that language barriers also cause mental issues such as dissatisfaction, anxiety, and imposter syndrome, and also impede the development and progress of international collaboration. So the consequence of language barriers to the generation of evidence by non-native English speakers is huge. So now that hopefully we all know language barriers can have serious consequences for conservation and science, the question is how we can solve these problems. And I'll say it's not easy at all. And we definitely need a concerted effort at every single level, from individuals to institutions and societies. And in this article, we compiled 10 simple tips for overcoming different types of language barriers in science. I won't go into the detail of each point today, but let me show you a few examples. First, disseminate research in multiple languages. Some academic journals have recently started recognizing the importance of multi-language dissemination of scientific findings and now encourage their authors to provide abstracts in non-English languages and also write a blog post on their papers in other relevant languages. So this is the example of a blog post published in both English and Japanese in the Journal of Applied Ecology. This is another example from the project I'm involved in, where we provided abstracts in 7 different languages. And it seems that providing non-English language abstract does help decision makers. In our survey with authors of national biodiversity reports, almost half of the authors reported that having non-English language titles and abstracts would help them search and understand English language literature. So it does help. In that sense, Integrative Conservation is doing a great job providing the Chinese language title and abstract of every single paper, which is great. And in our recent survey with 736 journals in biological sciences, we found that at least 18% of the journals state on their websites that alternative language abstracts are allowed. And 33% of the editors-in-chief answered that they would publish alternative language abstract, at least if requested. So next time you are publishing your paper in any journal, don't forget to ask the journal whether they can publish the abstract of your paper in any other languages. And if possible, go ahead and publish your abstract in alternative languages. Next, make sure to use knowledge sourced from multiple languages. Of course, this depends on the focus of your activities, but if you are working on issues that occur across multiple countries, never assume that all relevant information is available only in English. One simple solution is to find collaborators who are native speakers of different languages, just like we did for this study. We worked with over 50 collaborators for this study to search in 16 different languages. Today, science is highly globalized, so finding native speakers of, for example, Spanish, Portuguese, French, and Chinese is not that difficult. And indeed, it works. In this paper, we found that the systematic literature review by authors with more diverse language background actually searched for papers in more languages. And this also highlights the importance of developing culturally diverse environments in academia. We need a diverse range of people to make the best use of knowledge that is available from around the world. You also need to use appropriate literature search systems to find non-English language literature. For example, you can use Google Scholar, which covers pretty much any language, and also local literature search systems that are specific to each language. See this paper, for example, for a list of language-specific literature search systems. We have also compiled a list of 466 peer-reviewed non-English language journals in ecology and conservation, which is available from our website here. And box 1 of this paper also provides some practical suggestions on how we could make better use of non-English language literature. So please have a look at this paper as well. These should be a good starting point for anyone who wants to explore scientific evidence available in non-English languages. We still have so many things to do in order to overcome language barriers for non-native English speakers. In this paper, we provided a list of actions to address language barriers to non-native English speakers that can be adopted by different actors, from individuals and institutions to journals, funders, and conferences. And many of these actions are related to providing various types of practical, financial, and mental support to non-native English speakers, as shown in red here. And another set of critically important actions are to distinguish the quality of science and the quality of English when assessing science and scientists, as shown in yellow here. At the moment, unfortunately, these actions are rarely adopted in the scientific community. For example, in this paper led by Henry Arenas Castro, we surveyed 736 journals in biological sciences to assess how linguistically inclusive their policies are. We then found out that few journals actually provide genuine support to non-native English speakers. For English editing services, for example, 41% of the journals provide no English editing support, while 58% simply direct authors to commercial services, which I'd say is not genuine support, as many researchers around the world can't afford to use such commercial services just because it's too expensive. And only 6% and 4% have instructions to reviewers and editors, respectively, to explicitly distinguish the quality of science from the quality of language in submitted manuscripts. Nevertheless, a small number of journals already provide very good English editing support for non-native English speakers, so we should definitely expand such efforts to many other journals that have been doing almost nothing to date. Some conferences have also recently started to provide support for non-native English speakers, such as allowing multi-language presentations or offering a mentoring system where non-native English speakers can receive support for presentation preparations. Quite often, we blindly assume that everyone needs to speak in English at international conferences. But this example nicely illustrates that there are still many things we can do to support non-native English speakers and increase the diversity in scientific communities. Talking about conferences, the 32nd International Congress for Conservation Biology 2025, which is ICCB 2025, will take place in Brisbane, Mianjin, Australia, where I'm currently based, in 2025, which is the next year. I think it's June. At this conference, we are committed to reducing the language barriers for participants as much as possible, and we are currently exploring a wide range of options for supporting participants. We have already come up with a wide range of potential supports we can provide at the conference to reduce language barriers, and are about to start distributing this survey, asking potential participants for their views on what kind of support would be most helpful. So if you see this survey hopefully in a few weeks, please do participate and let us know your thoughts on how we can address language barriers at ICCP 2025. So this is not the survey link. So please remember, this is not the survey link. But if you are interested in ICCP 2025 in general, please register your interest here from this QR code. Anyway, hopefully more news to come soon, and hopefully we can see many of you in Brisbane in 2025 at this exciting conference. The most common question I seem to get when I talk about language barriers these days is whether AI can help us overcome language barriers. Obviously, now everyone is talking about AI. And I'll say my answer is yes, but with some caution. Although they may not be perfect, recent AI tools such as ChatGPT, DeepL, Writeful, and so on can provide useful and, importantly, free or affordable English editing services for non-native English speakers. But we know the rise of AI tools has also created new issues. Aside from the other commonly discussed issues around copyright and its accuracy, for example, the performance of AI tools can vary greatly among languages and is still far from sufficient in languages with low digital resources. Some tools, especially those of higher quality, are often not for free. So this may give rise to another inequality issue, as privileged researchers are more likely to be able to leverage such AI tools. I know that some societies, including the British Ecological Society, as you can see here, have recently integrated such AI tools into their submission systems so that authors who are submitting papers can use those AI tools. So I believe this is an important step forward. Related to this, in January last year, the journal Science declared that they will ban the use of text generated by ChatGPT or any other similar AI tools. Obviously, this resulted from the concern that some people might use ChatGPT when writing their papers, and this is understandable, and it's becoming a huge issue in universities and other institutions as well. However, as I said, AI tools can provide very useful and, importantly, free or affordable English editing services for non-native English speakers. And this is particularly important in terms of achieving equity in science, because, as our recent work here showed, researchers from lower income countries can't afford to use paid English editing services and are therefore disproportionately disadvantaged by this policy update. So clearly, Science's updated policies reflect a biased native English speaker-oriented view of the use of AI tools in scientific writing. So we immediately wrote a letter to Science, led by Violeta Verde-Espinola, explaining how those AI tools could help to achieve better equity in science by reducing language barriers. And the good news is that in response to our letter, the journal has later loosened its AI policy to allow researchers to use large language models to proofread their manuscripts with proper disclosure. So this was great news, but this example clearly shows that many journals still don't provide genuine support to non-native English speakers, and we need a concerted effort to change this situation. Okay, so that basically concludes my talk today. And lastly, I would like to thank all the collaborators over 130 collaborators of a translate project with a huge, truly huge contribution. I only speak Japanese and a bit of English, so our work would literally be impossible without their help. So I'd like to thank all the collaborators and supporters. And we are still working on many other exciting research and solutions. So please do visit our website. This is Translate Project website. This is my research group's website called Kaizen Conservation Group. And if you are interested, please contact us anytime to solve this important challenge in conservation science. Thanks very much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amano. So then we can start a Q&A. So then before we do the Q&A, I want to do a couple of comments. One is we have one student who is asking for collaborators in translating credit, the taxonomy of author contribution to papers. So then he's particularly keen looking for people with native languages from Africa, but languages from any other part of the world are welcome. So his name is Caleb, and Caleb will be posting that information on the chat box. So if you are interested, please look at his comment and contact Caleb directly. And also, thank you, Tatsuya, for the very interesting and very important presentation. And I'm gonna talk as the editor of integrative conservation. This is something that has been very important for us from the very beginning. And in our case, integrative conservation is published from Sichuan, which is in the Golden Triangle in China, but very close to Myanmar, Laos, Vietnam. So we're in a place extremely rich in human diversity, culture, languages. So that we have a lot of minority groups in the municipality where we are based, and our research groups contain people from many countries. And very few native speakers. Our institution has very few. So the people who began work on the journal were very few native English speakers. So we made a strong effort to think about what were the implications of being non-native speakers developing a journal that was going to be global, but understanding that many of our authors and our readers will be non-native English speakers. So then it's something that is very, very important for us. And I just want to mention to the audience that Integrative Conservation has an in-house English editing service that we provide only when a manuscript is about to be accepted. So then not for all this manuscript, but when within the manuscript is accepted, is going to be accepted, we tell the authors not to worry because we will be able to polish the language. And our policy determines that we don't reject papers based on language. Okay, so then we try to discriminate the difference between science quality and language quality. But of course, it's difficult for people who struggle. We had some papers from countries which we could tell that it was a real challenge for the authors who had very interesting data to put it in a format that would be acceptable. And even in some cases, we linked together some of our staff with some authors because there was no other way that we felt that we could move to finalize the manuscript. So I want to encourage people to think that the language will not be a final barrier for getting your work published. Also, we published the abstract, the title, the abstract, a plain language summary, and practitioners' key points in English and Chinese, plus any other language relevant to the study. But that depends on the author. So we always encourage, by default, we encourage authors to submit this information in the language of the study, the place where the study was conducted, or any other relevant language. And here I want to call authors to make that effort, because I think sometimes authors, once that they are at that stage of the manuscript being accepted, they just want to get over it. But it makes a big difference when your abstract is in Bahasa Indonesia or in Swahili or in Portuguese, and then it's a completely different group of people who will have access to that information. So then I really encourage you authors to make that extra effort. And then, Amano, it's a difficult one. So then, my first thought was, we are living in a time in which AI is moving so fast, and you were just saying right now how everyone is asking you whether AI is going to solve this. But I think it's very likely that in the next 10 years, the amount of language barriers will reduce a lot. So, and how optimistic are you to be able to see that when you click into a journal website, you can choose which language you want to read the paper, all done by machine translation?
So in terms of writing communication, I think that is the future probably. Obviously, I can't predict the detail, and obviously I'm not an expert of AI stuff, so I can't say in the detail. But I'm expecting to see the future where anyone can publish their papers in any languages they want, and then the journal publish that paper in that language, any languages. And then people accessing those papers can use AI tools to, translate those papers into any languages. So in terms of writing communication, publication, the language barriers might be, in that way overcome in the near future. But I'm not sure if that is applicable to, for example, oral communication or any other, communication. So, it can even have, negative consequences for oral communication. For example, if people are more increasingly relying on the use of AI tools for writing communication, maybe that will reduce the English proficiency in those people. And then that will impede the oral communication, for example. So we can see, so many different possibilities. But in terms of scientific publications, I think the future might be like that. So you can publish any papers in any languages, and you can access any languages. So I think I'm not sure if it's too early for integrative conservation to start thinking about that, but it would be really great to if the journal can start thinking about, the total multilingualization of scientific publications. I have never seen such attempts in any journals around the world, but maybe we can start thinking about that.
Yeah, we thought about that when we began thinking about the journal, and we saw a couple of examples were very kind of a bit kind of in-house made. So then clearly we're not very user friendly, but I've never seen at least one journal that you could choose which language you wanted to read, and I would be very keen on exploring that option. Integrative conservation, I think, something we discussed before, and will be important to think about. Yeah.
Obviously, at the beginning, we can, provide disclaimer, this is the machine translated text. So you should refer to the original text in the language. But we can definitely experiment something like that.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, so it's a difficult thing when you were talking about how the hurdle race were non-native speakers. They had to spend more time reading and more time writing. They need to do proofreading, and then they had more rejections. So then I think journals can play a role there, but
yeah, definitely.
Still is not gonna be able to compensate for all this handicap. So then you provide some useful tips, but do you see any way to overcome the idea of having to ask native speakers to look at papers, or to having to spend more time doing revisions, or even spending more time reading?
Yeah, that's a tricky one, obviously. So yeah, I mean, the role of journals is definitely huge because journals are gatekeeper of science, and yeah, there are actually many things the journals can implement, including double-blind review, and also maybe making the instructions for editors and reviewers to explicitly distinguish the qualitative language and the qualitative science. That is something that has rarely been done in most journals. So yeah, the contribution from each solution might be small, but if all of those solutions are implemented, I think the effect must be huge, I think.
Mhm. Yeah, that's something
yeah,
right.
and I'm sure if this is, and also another thing so in that paper, so that paper on the survey of 736 journals in biological sciences is about to be published in Proceedings B. So please have a look at that paper. But in that paper, we also found that the power balance between publishers and journals can be a really important thing here, because publishers can have a strong power. So if they are really keen, they can support non-native English speakers. And journals itself rarely have power to implement of the solutions. So maybe convincing publishers to do something. I'm not sure if someone from Wiley is here, but that might be something we should explore more. Especially if journals are based on societies, institutions. Journals do not necessarily have much money, much funding, but publishers have. So
yeah, my feeling is that publishers will respond to the demand. If they depend on us, the community of people who make and use science. I think. And critical mass can be very important for a publisher that manages hundreds of journals. It's much easier to develop systems, to recruit people, than not for a journal that maybe the cost is too high for some of these things. And is there any benefit in being, at least multilingual? So someone who writes English as a second language, it's at least it has two languages. When I assume that many people from North America, from Australia, from the UK are less likely to have a second and third language than someone from India or from West Africa.
you mean the benefit of benefit
Yeah,
of
are
what?
you aware of any benefit of that something that is not a barrier, but it's a benefit that maybe people who speak English as a second language are people who
Okay, yeah,
develop language skills, have more creative. I don't know, is any
So
data or any?
yeah, so I'm always saying the being a non-native English speaker is actually so that means actually you have a skill in science and especially conservation, because you can bridge the community between different cultures, between different languages. So that is a really important skill in conservation. Because as I said, many people around the world are communicating in using so many different languages, and conservation needs to be delivered to those people, including the general public and decision makers, policy makers, and so on. And those papers communicate in different languages. So if you are non-native speakers, that means you can at least, understand English and your own language. So you can bridge, those two communities. So that is a really important skill. But that skill is hugely overlooked in academia, conservation society. So we should see, non-native speakers as an important asset in conservation communities. And our research is exactly doing that. So, for our paper published in 2021, we collaborated with over 50 or even 60 different people who are native speakers of a total of 17 different languages. And just thanks to their contribution, that project was possible. So that exactly means their skills are necessary to do this kind of research. So that is a huge benefit, I think.
Yeah. So people who want to make comments, please, you can just type your comments in your chat box, either in CoShare or in Zoom, and we will read them. Tatsuya, just to let you know, we had around 1,200 people in CoShare and 30 something to 40 people in Zoom. And my final comment, I was very surprised. It's not your original research, but you mentioned in one of the slides that non-native speakers were suffering more from imposter syndrome, and that I found that interesting. And what do you think is the cause for that?
I think that's kind of, reasonable result. The not being able to communicate confidently and sufficiently definitely causes some mental health issues. You have more anxiety, it's very uncomfortable, embarrassing. So that causes a lot of issues for your mental health. I mean, your mental. So it's not that surprising to me. And I think we all experience that at least to some degree, for example, when talking in conferences. So that's why at the ICCB 2025, we are trying to, reduce that kind of language barriers as much as possible. If people are confidently communicating, we will use English. English is the common language of science in the conference. But if non-native English speakers are confidently communicate in English at the conference, that would be the ideal situation. So that is something we are trying to achieve at this conference.
Yeah, as a personal anecdote, I was in ICCB 2007 in Port Elizabeth in South Africa, and I was taking part in a student session. So it was a whole day of student presentations, morning, afternoon. And I remember very, very vividly how I felt that every English native speaker sounded smarter, deeper, more under control. And I remember discussing this with some students from other countries and say, well, it was like a different level of communication. It's just the way that the information was conveyed, but also, I guess, as your study shows, the whole cycle of the process is delayed by having to make extra effort to understand, to process the information, to regenerate, and definitely has a serious cost on particularly on young people, I think. So then let's move to the audience questions. We have a questions by Christos Mamides from Frederick University in Cyprus. Say, great work, Amano. Thank you very much. Given that generative AI tools are here to stay, do you think we should be already developing and offering courses training students and researchers about how to ethically use such tools in scientific research, for example, for language improvement? And worried, I cannot see it says, and worried that currently it is easier for journals and institutes to ban their use rather than deal with the associated intricacies. Perhaps such courses have a role in making sure that these tools are used in a positive manner, reducing language barriers. Yeah, very important point.
I think that's a great question. I mean, great suggestion, and I definitely agree. And I think some sort of information is emerging now, so we can see some, for example, articles discussing how to use generative AI things for English editing services, for English editing and grammar check and so on. But I haven't seen any proper courses developed. So providing that kind of training opportunity, I don't know, maybe at journals or at conferences would be a great opportunity, definitely. Yeah, that's great. Actually, that's great suggestion. So we might be able to think about that for example, integrative conservation or maybe ICCP. Yeah, so thanks very much.
Yep, very good point, yeah. And then we have a question by Giovanni Perez. So as a non-English speaker, researcher, I spend an absurd amount of time trying to find, read, and understand literature in English. I don't even consider looking at literature in different languages other than my native or English. What would you recommend to overcome this barrier?
So I normally say, if you're individual researcher, for example, if you're a PhD student, master student doing your review study, I normally say, it's not mandatory to search for other languages. So I totally understand and I'm totally aware that searching in, many other languages is a lot of work and you need to find collaborators. But if you are non-native English speakers, it might be even more difficult for you to find collaborators who speak other languages. So it's not necessary to search for non-English languages for your review work. But in that case, I would normally suggest, providing the limitation in your paper, for example, in your thesis or something like that. I didn't search for these languages. Also, there might be important research available in those languages. So just providing that kind of caveat in your paper report is recommended, I think.
Yeah, that's relevant. Yeah. Okay. Do we have any more questions from the audience? Do you have any question from co-share?
I guess people have already left for dinner.
People are going for dinner now. So then, yes, something that we have discussed before, but I was very clear that in integrative conservation we had to do a much better job with the author guidelines. So then, and require the guidelines because often we think about these things, we discuss about these things, but we don't make the effort of updating all the public-facing documents to make sure these things are very, very clear and visible for people who are looking for places to publish their work. So then we will work on that. And I also think I agree very much with Krista's comment that we need to use these AI generative tools for the good things. And it will be silly not to do it. And it's going to be difficult to find a balance between making sure that it's being used to things like polishing the grammar, polishing the style, and not generating ideas. And maybe as a personal comment, I will tell young people, students, not to rely too much on these things because as an editor, when I see, I can tell very often text that has been overly, polished by AI that has some kind of styles that are not natural.
Yeah, I know.
And it's very clear. Yeah.
Yeah. So the balance is really, really, really difficult. And yeah, so I guess that is something we need to learn from the training. Yeah. I'm also curious to know how we should think about the trade-off between those two problems, how to ethically and effectively use AI tools and how we can, how we do not rely too much on the use of AI tools when writing. Yeah.
And also I want to, emphasize the importance of thinking. So then language is kind of a formalization of ideas, right? So then people need to make the effort of trying to speak well, not just hoping that ChatGPT or whatever AI tool will do the fight. You can polish a little bit, but you need to make the effort of thinking clearly, thinking in a structured way, and having a good language is an indication of clear thinking, and that goes a long way. It's a very important skill that I encourage people to cultivate.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Okay, so then we've 5 more seconds to see if there is any more question, and if not, we will close the webinar. I'm being told that we had almost 1,300 people or clicks in co-share. And just remind to everyone that this video will be recorded and will be posted on our website, where you can see all the previous webinars as well. And I think we will keep it here. So then, Tatsuya, thank you very much. It has been very, very interesting and very important presentation.
Nice.
And I like a lot the diagram of the athletics course. And yeah, thank you very much. And see you all next month on the 2nd of April with Marcel Holyoke. Okay.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Don't worry, bye bye.
See ya.